to welcome Jennifer Rankin, Brussels correspondent at The Guardian, Alex Pigman, who is a Brussels correspondent for French newswire AFP. We have Sam Fleming, who's Brussels bureau chief at the FT. And we have, to bring a broadcast perspective, Jack Parrock from Euronews. Much to his disappointment, Ryan Heath has been prevented from joining us, but he's texted me some tips to share with you during the conversation, so he'll be hearing something or other. But let's launch into the conversation proper, starting with the practicalities of reporting in confinement or under lockdown. Many of us out there, or many of you out there, and us included, are sharing our workspaces with spouses, partners, pets, offspring, you name it. In fact, I saw on Twitter, I think it was yesterday, some chap had wandered stark naked into his wife's video call at work. Given that journalists are people too, and you will be putting up with your own challenges, juggling home life with work life, it would be great to talk to each of you about how your confinement is going in terms of your workspace. Starting with Alex, I gather you have a bit of homeschooling going on there. How are you managing to do that and yet keep up with the PC rhythm of a newswire?
It's not very easy, I have to say, just because everyone tells you that you're supposed to structure your day as best as possible, but if you're in the breaking news business, by definition, you can't really predict when the news will happen. Now, luckily in Brussels, things are a bit more predictable, even for breaking news. But the tough thing is to tell your kids that, you have a class that starts at, 1 p.m. and it'll be over at 2:30. And then, of course, then news happens, and then you have to be the big hypocrite who runs off into another room and covers the news. But luckily amongst my colleagues, there's an understanding, that we're facing this situation. So we all sort of, spot each other and are able to put on a brave face at home as best as possible for our kids.
Okay, it does sound a challenge though. And Sam, do you have homeschooling offspring featuring in your working day or night?
Yes, we're sharing homeschooling at the moment. We have 3 kids. The problem I've had occasionally is when a meltdown, our kids are very young, occurs during an interview. One interview I had yesterday with quite a senior policymaker, I had to explain why there was what sounded like a riot going on in the background. I've found people incredibly understanding, actually, of the circumstances we're all dealing with, not least because many of them are dealing with the same situations, working in quite close quarters with the rest of their family, however big or small that family may be, and or indeed on their own. And so it's quite an unusual situation for a reporter to be handling. Normally, when you're in the office, you can control your environment a bit more easily when you're dealing with people.
Those are interesting observations, and you coming from an economics background and very much covering the economic side of this, are you finding it more humanizing? I don't want to leap into stereotypes, but in the economic sphere, a lot of your contacts would be a bit more formal than perhaps anybody covering a more lifestyle or general beat. So you're finding it humanizing.
I think, no, I mean, there's a lot of continuity. Here in Brussels, I'm focusing a lot on the economics area as well. Economists are humans too, so I think there's a continuity in that way as well. Yeah, I mean, sure, helping to run running the European coverage here means I'm covering a wider array of topics than I was in the US when I was economics editor over there, very much focused on the Treasury and the Federal Reserve. Here I'm covering all the institutions and all the issues, but a lot of time at the moment really focused on the economics topics for obvious reasons. I really focused on the Eurogroup, ECOFIN, the financial and economic response to the coronavirus crisis.
That's great, and we'll get into a little bit later the kind of nitty-gritty of how you and your colleagues are getting the news. Jennifer, how is your workspace working out, as it were, in under this lockdown?
Well, I don't have any children, so I think it's certainly simpler for me. It's just in my home, it's me and my husband. We're both now sharing this home working space, and I think the main issue we have is just that we have one of the rooms in the house is the best for the internet connection. So sometimes we're constantly like sliding backwards and forwards between the room I'm in now, which is our living room, to get the strongest connection. So we have to sort of juggle who gets to use the internet and be on a call at any one time. But it's the same for everyone, doing a lot by video call, doing a lot of this kind of thing, a lot of Zoom. So yeah, so a very sort of different way of working than we're all used to in Brussels, where I think a lot is done face to face. Of course, you speak a lot on the phone to people, but we're so used to being able just to go and meet people for coffees, to go and have briefings, and to then catch the officials after the briefing. So it's a big change to how we are working.
Definitely, and we can get into the details of that. Don't tell me about tussling for the best room for the Wi-Fi. I think I'm sharing that too. Jack, being in broadcast, what do you need in your work? How's it changed your workspace and how you need to operate from there under lockdown?
Yeah, so I mean, I'm someone that works quite on the hoof normally with my kit and travels quite a lot. So for me, I have to say the first few weeks have been relatively enjoyable to spend a bit of time at home. I know that's like maybe an unpopular opinion, but it's been quite nice to be kind of rested and have some moments where I can focus on things. We have exactly the same thing with the internet, and obviously with sending video files and downloading my demands on the internet are snarling everyone else's up in our household. For me, the main thing is just trying, because obviously we're trying to produce things for video and trying to get into people's homes in a way that is respectful to their home and respectful to their abilities. So that's something I've worked quite hard on. I've done some different reports with different people where they're filming themselves and sending me through, but obviously it's a process that takes a lot more time than if I can just go for 20 minutes and film something with them. So that's been a workaround, but fortunately so far, I mean, the reality is for us as well, our broadcast schedule has been slightly reduced. So there's not quite so much airtime to fill, which means that there is a slight pressure off where we can focus on producing things.
And are there some instances where you are able to go outside and film?
Yeah, I've done 2 things out and about, and it feels bizarre, to be honest. And like most people, everyone's saying, unless it's absolutely necessary, that everybody should stay back. So we're having regular discussions about what is actually worth somebody leaving the house for.
Right. Alex, being at AFP on the English language side, you're more of a generalist, aren't you? And so I was wondering how you're going about getting the news now under lockdown. How much harder are you finding it than previously?
I think I dare say that it's not that different in a lot of ways. What was described earlier by Jennifer, you know, the peripheral stuff of running into people and catching officials at the end of briefings and all that, that's what's really missing. But the hard news that we agencies cover is pretty much the same, because that's obviously, you know, that usually comes off of statements, it comes off of emails, it comes off to by phone calls to officials that are expecting your call. It's all, you know, again, in Brussels, everything is quite regimented in a way, and especially for us news agencies. So we're not really hunting for the major scoops and trying to get a new angle and all that, even though that's part of our work. But what we really need to do is just cover the news as it's happening very quickly, and that when we do that in normal times, that's usually, you know, via phone calls, via statements, and via all that. What's not being done is the sort of, say, the anticipation work of taking coffees with people and having those conversations about, you know, with someone like yourself saying like, oh, what's coming down the pike in a couple of weeks, and you know, and talking to lobbyists and talking to officials who aren't on the front lines on the media front. That all that is gone, and I think over time, the longer this takes place, the longer we're in lockdown, I think the effects of that will be felt more and more, because we'll be ending up closer to covering news in a very sort of straightforward and non-nuanced way, which is, I think, the saddest part of this whole lockdown thing. But luckily, it's not that old yet, so that I personally don't feel that actual news gathering is suffering that much yet.
So far, absolutely. Sam, in terms of your collecting the news at the FT in Brussels, the commission midday briefings are still going ahead, but obviously there's no chance for follow-up questions. How limiting do you and your team find that in terms of getting the news?
Yeah, I mean, it's a huge shift, isn't it? To go from news conferences and briefings, press conferences, where you can have an interaction, follow up, maybe a couple of times with the person on stage, and try and get into a topic. As you see with the midday briefings, they can go on for quite a long time, with quite a lot of exchanges between an individual reporter and the spokesperson. To now, where you, in a sense, have to log a question. I've found it quite tricky. Often you might log a question which you think is a valid question, but they don't have time to get to it, or it's similar but not identical to another reporter's question, so they take that other question or maybe mesh the two. I've seen that quite a lot, and it means, I think, that the interactions are slightly more limited when it comes to the press conferences. That is something that we've come up against. I think they're basically handling it the best they can in the circumstances. I don't really see any easy alternative way of doing it. When I've been on conference calls with multiple reporters interviewing someone, it can get pretty chaotic. Frankly, often the link goes down during the call, and it ends up being, not ideal. So I can see why it's easier to log these questions via email or on some sort of in written format. But it does mean the interactions are a bit more stilted.
Yeah, that was the very word I was thinking, actually. I gather, for example, the Eurogroup press conference is done by WhatsApp video, and there are logged questions, etc., etc. So, it's a bit more staged, isn't it, by definition?
Yeah, I mean, I think again, I don't really see an easy alternative, but it does mean that the question, if your question is asked, that's great, but you can't really follow up on it.
Yes. Jennifer, are you finding the same kind of issue, being a bit more generalist as well? Do you find that it's harder to gather the news and also to kind of pursue particular points and angles that interest you?
Yeah, well, I certainly am a generalist, covering a bit of anything and everything. And I do agree with all what's been said so far. But I think another point to add is often that our sources, the people we're talking to, are not as informed as they were before the lockdown either, because often they're not in the meetings, or the meetings are happening. Say last week's European Council, all the leaders were on video link, so you didn't have the same diplomats sort of waiting in the wings and getting the readouts from the leaders' room. So then that information doesn't flow on to us either. So I think it's at every level there are just there are sort of blockages in the way, and things that, as a reporter, you're always trying to get the best possible view of what's happening behind closed doors and peer into the rooms that you can't see into. And now that's just become that much harder, because either the people who are closest to those closed doors either are less available, or they don't have the information themselves. So yeah, it's definitely a sort of change to how we're working. And also from the point of view of our paper, we also like to sort of get out and about and do now and not as a staple, but now and then some sort of color reporting as well, about maybe a little slice of life in Belgium, or and of course, obviously, that's all ground to a halt as well. So it changes the kind of reporting you can do.
Altogether limiting, really. And I think about the point about your sources not being as close to the action as they may have been previously certainly adds another level of challenge, really. Jack, from the broadcast perspective, you talked a bit about your creative workarounds in terms of getting the news. It sounds a whole lot harder. I'm not sure how much you depended on the Commission midday briefing in the past, but does this lack of follow-up questions pose extra challenges for you as well?
I mean, I personally, my feeling, while I understand that it's not been like ideal to have all the questions and follow-ups that everyone can have, I personally think they've done a relatively good workaround with it, and they are spending quite a lot of time. There's this council WhatsApp group where they're being annoying and delaying everything as always, but they are going with it. I had on what Jennifer was saying, I had a friend who said that the best source in Brussels right now would be a good hacker, because they could get into the video conference calls rather than being on the side. But yeah, actually for us, I mean, for us, it's not very nice to be able to put these sort of video conference calls, the shots and the way that things look on TV. We're really struggling to give sort of nice, aesthetically pleasing pieces to a camera filming a video, a screen playing a Skype thing as your soundbite for the midday. It's not ideal, but again, for us, it's relatively, as long as it's usable and we can hear it, that's what we're doing. What I'm spending a lot of time doing is chasing people to record Skype calls afterwards. We're using our graphics department a ton so that they can just sort of make things a bit nicer, and also just trying to find different things, because I think one of the things at the moment as well is that the information, because we're not getting so much sideline information, it is all sort of one channel. A lot of it, like everyone's been saying, it's sort of, there aren't too many options. So just trying to make things look a bit different by adding, different shots. But it's an uphill battle, I think.
So by definition, it's much more controlled, even though the four of you seem to agree that the EU institutions are doing a relatively good job. And in fact, the other day, Commission President von der Leyen said that it's now more important than ever for journalists to be able to do their jobs, to counter fake news and disinformation. Is there, and this is just a little bit devil's advocate, is there not all officials like transparency, and is this an opportunity nonetheless for those who like to work in the background to stay in the background and not be transparent, given that there's a perfect cover for that there isn't the opportunity to grill officials at the end of the midday briefing as there had been previously? Is it more likely that as journalists you might be missing a beat just because there's more control over what you are getting? Alex, would you have a view on that?
I do feel that everything is, even before coronavirus, everything is, I feel in the recent years has just sort of felt more controlled, and the talking points are much more disciplined, and it's sort of become a problem without having this special setting. Now, whether this increases it or not, I guess by definition it does. But on the other hand, I do find that when I have to call officials, because of the circumstances so far, and in most cases, there's an efficiency to the conversations that there wasn't before. So if you're sort of talking to someone and there's other journalists around, and a colleague asks a question, and there's a conversation that starts, and then you have to wait around to get your question in, and then it's not a very efficient system, and it doesn't always work, because sometimes the official just runs out the door. But what I find now is that you call them, and if they answer you, then you're very quickly to the point. You get your question, they give you your answer, and at the same time, if they don't answer you, which I think comes to your point, they're not answering your phone call. So AFP has called X, and X has not called back AFP or The Guardian or FT or Euronews, so it's a much more direct relationship. While at the end of a briefing or in a hallway, it's like, oh, I didn't see you, or oh, I'm sorry, I missed your call, but call my colleague, and but here it's just like the call is in, the WhatsApp is in, and you either respond or you don't, and if you don't, I know you didn't.
That's interesting. Jack, you were nodding there as if it's your experience.
So I'm maybe don't quite work in the same way as the rest of these guys here, but for me, I'm having, in some cases, easier access to certain people who, sort of run away from us TV guys a little bit quicker perhaps than they do with the rest of the guys on the panel. And some of them are spending a bit more time being efficient, giving me the answers, moving on again, and sort of picking up the phone or replying to a text message. Not in all circumstances, but in some circumstances I've had more success in this time, probably because they're at home, just sat working and available rather than running off somewhere else. I don't know.
And they want an excuse to work in the quiet room away from all the other people. Jennifer, as the Guardian correspondent here, are you finding fewer people are running for cover when you try to contact them, or are you finding the opposite?
Well, I haven't really noticed a change in either direction of people avoiding me more than they did before we went into lockdown. And I think it's to your question, for me, it feels it's a bit too soon to tell as to whether this has an impact on maybe making institutions less transparent. I mean, clearly all the EU institutions are trying to get their message out there about how they're handling the coronavirus, and in the last few years, as Alex said, the Commission especially has become much more sort of controlled in its messaging. It puts a lot more out there, and is now sort of putting out a lot on social media as well. We've seen a lot of videos of Ursula von der Leyen. So there's clearly a certain messaging coming out. Whether this is good or bad for transparency in the long run. I mean, certainly it's detrimental for the reasons we've all talked about the difficulty of following up questions. But I don't have the sense yet that anyone's using it as a pretext to avoid journalists, but maybe just because often there's a lot of improvisation and things are happening quickly. So maybe that sort of plays its part as well in things sometimes being a bit more organized at the last minute. But yeah, so I wouldn't say it's either sort of good or it's certainly it's not good for transparency, but I haven't seen any really sort of detrimental impact either. But of course that could change in the weeks to come, depending on how long this goes on for.
It'll be interesting to keep an eye on it, really, won't it? But Sam, we all know that nobody runs from the FT. In fact, it's the opposite in Brussels and elsewhere. So I'm sure that I'd be interested in any observations that you had about it, whether it was more or less difficult to get to perhaps officials who may have the answer to that question, burning question that you have, and may have been elusive previously.
I think, and what I'd say is what you miss is the serendipity that goes with being a reporter wandering around these buildings and bumping into people, sitting in a waiting room and someone walks out who you were quite likely managed to grab a quick word with. Just the human interaction you get as a reporter wandering around the institutions, which we do all day, all of them. As I say, just bumping into people and chatting to them in the corridors. That's what you just cannot do that at the moment. And reporters are fundamentally social creatures. We like going out and meeting people and sitting down having coffees or drinks or lunch or dinner with them and nattering and spending at least 80% of our time nattering about things which may not actually really have a particular angle or whatever, or just because we enjoy listening to people and chatting with them. And it's very frustrating not being able to do that at the moment. Obviously you can to an extent on the phone, but it is different, you know. It's never quite the same as sitting down face to face with someone. And as I said, the serendipity bit is something you miss as well. So you lose, I think you do lose a dimension as a result of this lockdown, unfortunately.
Yeah, the human contact, bumping into somebody at Café Veganiano or anything like that is really definitely lacking. I was wondering, we've been talking very much about the EU institutions which you're working with. Also, you have people like myself and my colleagues, pesky lobbyists and communicators, and also people from corporates and trade associations too. It'd be interesting to know what advice you would have for anybody wanting to work effectively with you at this time, and what should they bear in mind? I'll start with you, Alex, and be as frank as you like. Most of us are sitting down.
Yeah, no, it's tough. I mean, I do feel for your community, just because right now, we're so focused on coronavirus and just like the hot news of this outbreak, that I do receive a few emails, and frankly, and they're not uninteresting, but it's just I don't have the time, or I know that the people involved in that story don't have the time. My advice, I think, at this stage of the game is probably just like have a break, wait a little bit. Reassure your clients that it's going to come back, and it's going to, the bubble will be back, and it'll be huge because there'll be so many regulatory governance issues that come up from this. But right now, it's just like everyone. I think it'll be really hard to get our attention. It's just as simple as that.
Don't be tone deaf, in other words.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's just this, the right now. I mean, I wake up in the morning and I listen to the RTBF local radio, and it's never been more local than I've ever heard a radio in my life. I mean, it's just literally just the news of Belgium, and it goes on for 20 minutes, and I think it's like that the whole world over. And so the stories from Brussels, which are sort of cosmopolitan and internationalist by definition, we're just not going to get a lot of space. Except on the specific stories, like we were talking about, Italy and Spain vis-a-vis the EU's response to the economic hit there and all that. But just the tech story, the Green New Deal story. I mean, we do our best, but it's not going to get a lot of traction at this stage. That's my opinion.
Points taken. Jennifer is a long-time Brussels resident and somebody who has covered the EU for some time. Are you finding that balance shifting in terms of the appetite for what it is that the Guardian wants for you, and also are you the recipient of some material that is completely out of sync with the reality that we're living with this virus?
Well, it does feel like coronavirus sort of ate the news, and it's obviously overwhelming everything. But I mean, we're still trying to do non-coronavirus news, although often it turns out to be a coronavirus angle. For example, I'm still trying to stay very much on top of the migration topic, and especially the issue of migrants and asylum seekers in Greece, in the camps. We're still keeping a close eye on what's happening on the Greek-Turkey border, although it's just quietened down in the last few weeks. And so there is still, and also the situation in Hungary. That's something that we've been giving a lot of attention to. Again, there's a coronavirus link because the government has introduced these new emergency measures ostensibly in the name of fighting coronavirus. So there is definitely an appetite for news that isn't about coronavirus. It is just quite hard to find it at the moment.
I can imagine. And Sam, you're running a bureau. It's not all about coronavirus for the FT, obviously, in Brussels. How would you say that people out there who are wanting to work effectively with your bureau, what should they bear in mind? How should they approach FT journalists if they're wanting to be helpful and not a hindrance?
I have to say I agree with Alex. There may just need to be a patience element to this. Jennifer's right. I mean, there are other stories that we are following. It's not that we're literally 100% coronavirus, but even as Jennifer says, that Hungary, there is an element of connection with the coronavirus outbreak to that story, or at least how it's developed recently. I think there will be. It's a matter of time. I think as time goes on, and it feels like this is going to be with us for quite some time, and the after effects for a very long time, people will start wanting to have a bit more variety, and news editors will start their ears will prick up a little bit when they hear about a story which isn't related to the core topic. But when you think about just how far-reaching the impact of this is going to be in terms of society, in terms of how industries are shaking out, in terms of how economies are going to be affected, it's just enormous, this story. So I think trying to compete with that story with a particular angle as in the public relations realm is going to be really, really difficult. So I'm afraid, yeah, I would echo what Alex has said, and I'm afraid.
Don't worry, it's definitely big.
Carefully.
Jack, before we wind up, which we're going to soon, just to conclude with your take on this.
Yeah, well, so like everyone's saying, I think as reporters, our job is to contextualize everything, and there is no story in the world that is not contextualized in the COVID-19 outbreak. It's impossible. Anything that were to happen, you would have to say, despite the coronavirus or because of, everything is relevant to it. For us in TV, when it comes to groups and people trying to approach us, things that have been making it to air is when there is a clear suggestion of how they can help with any video or whatever. So things like that have been useful for us, and ways, for us, the sort of messaging that we've been getting from certain people is obviously interesting, but if they also can visualize it, then our sort of and finalies in our bulletins can be related to those things. So my advice for people working in communications is to think visually. For us, I mean, that's obviously a normal thing, but I also think that basically our whole industry is re-gearing now to just deal with this entire story, and I think every industry in the world is doing the same thing, basically. So I think that everybody will have to just deal with the fallout of this.
Absolutely. Just thank you so much. Just before we end, Ryan's tips: be skeptical of public statistics and learn from others. His learning has forced him to think global. So with those words from across the Atlantic, I would like to thank the four of you very much for taking time out from your busy day to share these insights. It sounds like it might be fruitful to check in about a couple of weeks to see how the information flow is going. And I also want to thank everybody out there who's signed and listened, and wish you all a good rest of the day, and watch this space for our next virtual Brussels calling. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you, Victoria. Bye.
Thank you, guys. Bye.